combination of digital engraving tools and algorithms to generate a series of tests. Ultimately, the digitally generated single line making up the print had to be manipulated and adjusted entirely by hand over a period of several months. As Farnsworth stated, to achieve dimensionality, the line has to traverse the topography of the face at angles that demand a radical departure from the spiral. Even the smallest single hair on Phil's head required a corresponding minute undulation in the line. This print perfectly illustrates a critical aspect of Chuck's work. Throughout his career, Chuck has given the forgotten, eschewed, or abandoned in art a contemporary edge, from figurative painting and portraiture in oil to the mezzotint or the daguerreotype, heretofore also considered dead. As a critic has noted, close gives the old medium a jolt of primitive conviction. And Chuck has kept all of this not just alive, but relevant and stunning, not with radical statements or grand posturing, but with a perpetually inventive spirit and plainly with the stark power of images. Chuck's commitment to invention was also generative. His subject, the human head, was constant, but a photograph that becomes the basis for painting could generate a drawing that would then be made into a print, the technique for which could create another painting. In the early 1980s, Chuck replaced the seamless, flat, and almost photographic quality of his airbrush paintings with a heavily textured paper pulp works that were likened to tree bark. He first made grid editions using grills of small squares half-inch deep, into which wet pulp mixed with varying shades of gray pigment were injected. Working on these multiples, he found that the patties of wet pulp that dripped to the floor would dry into an array of beautifully textured ovoid paper chips. No two were alike. They had natural, irregular outside edges formed by gravity, not by artistic decision. These miniature meadow muffins, the size of Pringles potato chips, inspired the production of paper pulp discs in various tones, which were then glued onto canvas to create collages, the first being Georgia collage. Then, retranslating the painting into a print, a brass shin based on the tracing of the edges of the collage chips was made as a custom-built grill for a further iteration of the same image of his daughter. Chuck said, "You don't know what is going to happen when you effect a transition from a painting to a print. It's a bit like translating a poem from German into English. If you translated it directly, the verb would end up at the end of the sentence and it wouldn't read right. So you have to understand the content in one and then find a new language to make it in the second one that means the same thing as the first. It's not a direct one-to-one translation." In the 1980s, when he reveled in the technical wizardry and variety of these inventive ways to render heads, he also began to adjust his own attitude toward his work. In trying to figure out what dumb, but consistently scaled unit he could use to fill grid squares with, he thought, what could be more uniform or basic a standard than one's own fingerprint? But the fingerprint works were also inspired by a book illustration of a tantric Sri Yantra he had seen. A diagram meant to stimulate meditation. The caption noted that upon sensing that it had lost its power, the gurus reactivated it by pressing red ink impressions, other thumbs onto its surface. He said, "The interesting thing about working in the fingerprints was making art without a tool. My body became the tool. I could feel how much paint I was picking up and how much I was putting down. I loved the physicality in the process." Creating fingerprint drawings of his family and closest friends, these both communicated and embodied an unmistakable humanism, something he could no longer deny, particularly after making Fanning finger painting. From afar, it was an image with almost photographic resolution, but up close, it dissolved into shards or fragments, thousands and thousands of the artist's fingerprints, illustrating how he arrives at figuration through abstraction, even if the abstraction comprises the lines on his own thumb. Chuck acceded to grounds for psychological readings of his portraits and identified Fanning finger painting, the portrait of his grandmother-in-law, as perhaps the ultimate realization that what I was doing was, in fact, far more about the person than I had ever realized myself. Fanning was the only surviving member of her family. Her 9 brothers and sisters, her mother and father, and all her aunts and uncles were killed during the Holocaust. vaporous quality of a mirage that threatens to dematerialize at any moment. It is an emotionally sweeping image. As a critic had written about it, it is as if Close had peeled a layer of his own skin and shaped the image in its folds and textures. Grand and delicate at the same time, fanny finger painting is flesh made with flesh. For me, this was Chuck's idiosyncratic way of marrying the rigors of minimalism with the vigor of abstract expressionism. It was in the 1980s that Chuck abandoned the airbrush and returned the evidence of the artist's hand on the canvas. The love of physicality he mentioned, with his hands literally getting dirty, squeezing paper pulp, and with his bare fingers directly marking the canvas. It was toward the end of this decade that he also lost his ability to use his hands. In December 1988, a spinal artery collapsed, leaving him paralyzed. Close has been referred to as a conceptual artist's favorite figurative painter, and his work has been analyzed through the precepts of process-oriented minimalism. It has been said that his work can best be evaluated according to what the self-imposed rules and formulae yield, since limitations are to be judged by what they produce. Another critic pushed it further by stating that his works evidence how constraints are the precondition of freedom. Chuck has often asserted the following: ease is the enemy of the artist. It's always wrong before it's right. Get yourself in trouble. Problem solving is highly overrated. Problem creation is far more interesting. I like putting rocks in my shoes. Extricating yourself from a technical corner is a catalyst for creativity. The closest, most exacting constraint was neither willed nor anticipated. The partial quadriplegia that he has faced and lived with since 1988, when he suffered a spinal aneurysm. In the earliest days of the accident, Close briefly considered becoming a conceptual artist whose work could be made by others through sets of instructions, but his love of painting was too strong. I'll spit paint onto a canvas if I have to, he said. With a modicum of regained movement in his arms and with his characteristic unstinting resolve, Close resumed painting. The collapse of his spinal artery has typically been assumed as a catalyst for his overtly gridded paintings. All of his paintings dating back to 1967 are grid-based, but the difference is in how visible the grid is, triggered by the 1972 Mezzotint. And besides the first gridded paintings done by airbrush, Self-Portrait 58,424 and Robert 104,072, Close's first exploration of overtly gridded work in oil is Study for Linda, made in 1977, a year after the large continuous stone acrylic was completed. This proves that Chuck had started to paint in these incremental grids a decade before his spinal aneurysm. A critic had said of these early gridded works, faces dissolve into dots and squares, circles in a grid coalesce into heads as if pressed behind a screen. 3 years later, he painted 2 versions of Stanley, both oils on canvas. This marked his return to oil paints and paintbrushes. He had abstained from oils for more than a decade and found that he had missed the luscious richness of oil paint. De Kooning had said flesh was the reason why oil painting was invented. In fact, the inventor of oil painting, Jan van Eyck, who died in 1445, was himself a great portraitist. The flesh in Chuck's grid paintings in oil were disciplined pinks and reds, overlaid with strokes of blue, ochre, purple. And by 1988, just before his spinal aneurysm, his solo exhibition featured canvases with a more acidic palette and even variations of grid orientation, including diagonal and concentric ones. Here are other examples. These anticipate the paintings he is able to continue to paint after his paralysis. Having regained some arm movement, he began to paint again by strapping a paintbrush to a splint around his wrist. Alex, too, was the first painting Close completed after his spinal aneurysm. For this reason, this painting has been the subject of extensive analysis, even warranting a full chapter in Christopher Finch's 2010 biography of the artist. The painting is among those most frequently cited for its psychology. This kind of analytical reading is one that the artist has generally been known to discourage. Remember, he even initially disavowed the humanist content of his portraits. However, Close himself has recalled how his assistant at the time of his recovery reminded him that when I was working on that painting, I painted it with tears dripping down my face. It has been noted that the expressionist standard of the painting evidences both the, quote, unfettered freedom that belies the physical pain and psychological uncertainty that must have been a constant accompaniment to the making of the painting, and the pure pleasure in having overcome extreme adversity, the simple joy of being able to paint again. Chuck himself said of this painting, "The image is profoundly sad compared to the first painting based on the same photograph of Alex. So something must have happened. It sort of looked like a crying clown. The other thing is that the painting is brighter than the paintings I have been making. The color was actually more intense. So there is a celebratory aspect to the work. One might even say, although I'm not exactly sure I would use this word, that the painting was happier, but it was a brighter palette, so it was simultaneously happier and sadder. And the rest is history." For the next 25 years since his spinal aneurysm, Chuck would take a photograph and slide a sheet of acetate with a specific size grid to see how the rhythmic beat of the squares fall on the image. Honeycomb with deep cells crammed with color, movement, and odd little cartoon shapes. De Kooning's influence crept back into his work in the way paint smears together wet in wet. You see both image and constitutive mark, both projective figure and material ground, referred to as the ungraspable mechanism at work in Chuck's painting, how it is impossible to focus on marks and take in the whole image at the same time, calling to mind the expression, "You cannot see the forest for the trees." In the case of Chuck's paintings, seeing the gestalt of the image snapping into focus as a face is the magic, and seeing the individual components reveals the mechanics of the magic created. Watchful and meditative, his subjects stare out through the shimmer of glass bead segments with their essential humanity undamaged, and in fact celebrated in velvety grace or ingots of color and inscapes of organic contour. Working on a catalog resume, itself a kind of portrait of a master portraitist, can be daunting. Thankfully, Chuck's own life is instructive. In 1995, John Boyer wrote a book titled Chuck Close, Life and Work. Close's most definitive monograph by Christopher Finch is Chuck Close's work, and the canon publication, also by Finch, is the biography Chuck Close, Life. To Chuck, work and life are inextricably intertwined. If process wills the form in his art, it is work that wills the living in his life. The enduring magnet of physiological phenomena, Chuck has severe dyslexia and prosopagnosia, or face blindness, an inability to recognize the topography of the face. He found that if he broke a task at hand into parts, it was easier to deal with. Thus is God, or the devil, in each brutal detail, in the fingerprint, the lozenge, the crosshatch, or the infinitesimal thread in a tapestry. One day, it dawned on him that his paintings were no different from blankets or tablecloths that his grandmother crocheted or quilted. Stitch by stitch, brushstroke by brushstroke, quilt square by quilt square, grid unit by grid unit, the whole is slowly built. Here he talks about how he works through a canvas.
I'm feeling it, I'm getting used to that rhythmic beat with the pink melody. I'm getting used to, and I find it, I don't measure, I use no mathematics whatsoever. It's all bumping into things and finding and feeling it, and it's all the journey.
He has also used a literary analogy to his way of working. He said, "All the work I've done has that building block, incremental nature. I've always been overwhelmed by problems as a whole. How am I going to make this thing? Not only that, I'm plagued by indecision. So it's liberating to turn this formidable series of decisions into little yes or no choices. For me, the real joy is in putting copies of these silly little marks together. Some of them look like hot dogs, some of them look like donuts, but they're pictorial syntax. I build a painting by putting those marks together just the way a writer makes a novel by slamming words together. The publication, A Couple of Ways of Doing Something, showcases his collaboration not only with the photographer Jerry Spagnoli on creating the daguerreotypes that make the medium startlingly contemporary, but also with the poet Bob Holman. Together, they created double portraits of the 20 artists featured here, including Andres Serrano, Cindy Sherman, Lorna Simpson, Kiki Smith, and James Turrell, each with a photo portrait by Chuck and a praise poem written by Holman. As Chuck's catalog resonates online, I'm able to include multimedia components such as audio and video files in the catalog. So here's the daguerreotype of Bob Holman, and here's the recorded reading of the praise poem he wrote for himself.
Beautiful in a poem this year. Signed, the rest of the world except for you.
And here's James Turrell. Here's a fantastic detail of the daguerreotype. And a praise poem for Turrell as read by Holman. I don't think I have the audio for this. He reads this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5.